Good afternoon. Good afternoon. And good afternoon to everyone who is joining us on the internet as well. Today we will continue with my reading from the transcript as prepared by Bill Thetford. And the section today begins, the subject of the section today is the ego-body illusion. And before we even begin reading, let's just take a look at those words. The ego-body illusion. It's so commonplace for students of the course to call the body and the world illusion. But the reason we have this subject is to pinpoint the fact that a relationship between the ego and the body is illusory. The relationship between the ego and the body is illusory. So I will begin. All things work together for good. There are no exceptions, except in the ego's judgment. Control is a central factor in what the ego permits into consciousness. Again, control is a central factor in what the ego permits into consciousness, and one to which it devotes its maximum vigilance. This is not the way a balanced mind holds together. And now we have a very interesting sentence. Its control is unconscious. A balanced mind's control is unconscious. A balanced mind, one which is in equilibrium, is one which is not maintaining a sense of itself as separate, independent, self-authoritative. A balanced mind is a mind which has joined with, yielded to, and moves in harmony with God. When one is being in this manner, control is not consciously exercised. Why? Because self-protection is uncalled for, and control is only employed as a means of self-protection. A balanced mind joined with the Father. In other words, you, being from that place of excellence within yourself, not having to exercise control, and yielding to the Father, will find yourself being and doing, acting, behaving, just as Paul is at this moment, without conscious, ego-minded direction or authority. You find yourself simply being appropriate. And mind you, being appropriate doesn't mean everyone holding A Course in Miracles study groups, as we are doing right now. Being appropriate is coming from that place of excellence while you're grocery shopping or preparing dinner or bowling or gardening. Did you ever think of gardening with God? It sounds like the title of a new book. Or vacuuming with God. I'm not meaning to be funny here. I'm very serious. So, repeating this, meaning control, being a central factor, is not the way a balanced mind holds together. Its control is unconscious. The ego is further off balance by keeping its primary motivation unconscious and raising control rather than sensible judgment to predominance. The ego has every reason to do this, according to the thought system which gave rise to it and which it serves. And what is the ego's thought system? Self-preservation. Because it's not real. And the only way it has half a chance of being considered real is by joining with another and creating a mutual agreement about itself. And then spending eternity reconfirming the mutual agreement. Continuing, sane judgment would inevitably judge against the ego and must be obliterated by the ego in the interest of its self-preservation. A major source of the ego's off-balanced state is its lack of discrimination between impulses from God and from the body. Any thought system which makes this confusion must be insane. Yet, this demented state is essential to the ego, which judges only in terms of threat or non-threat to itself. In one sense, the ego's fear of the idea of God is at least logical, since this idea does dispel the ego. Now, why does the idea of God dispel the ego? Because the idea of God draws one's attention to a source beyond whatever mutually agreed definitions egos have come to. The idea of God involves, we'll say, a dimension beyond the highly coveted state of independence that is essential to the ego's existence. So just the idea of God interferes with the, I'm going to say, structural integrity of the mutually agreed upon definitions, which are intended to hold together and make real something that doesn't exist, an ego. Continuing, fear of dissolution from the higher source, then, makes some sense in ego terms, but fear of the body, with which the ego identifies so closely, is more blatantly senseless. And here we come to an interesting statement. The body is the ego's home by its own election. Like the ego went on a shopping trip with a realtor to find a new home. And it elected this one. How could the ego have elected a home that didn't exist before it started looking for a home? I keep saying over and over again that the body is the visibility and tangibility of your individuality. And your individuality is the presence of God. God expressed and expressing Himself, herself, right there where you are. Your body, therefore, is divine and as eternal as its maker, and its intent is to identify you perfectly, eternally. It is not an illusion. And this non-illusion, the ego chose to identify as its home. The way this happened was that when one Christ said, "But Father, I'd rather see it my way," and imaginatively gave new definitions to everything in the kingdom of heaven, and dissociated himself or herself from God, she was immediately faced with an experience of limits, of not being infinite. And in this act, all this Christ had available to itself was the specific identification of Himself, having lost the universal experience of Himself. And so it was natural to say, this is where my existence is, with the body, the specific identification. Now, I want you to understand that when you are awake, all of creation, all of the universe, and all of creation that goes beyond what you're aware of right now is your home and is that which identifies your being. Your body is all of creation. But when you chose not to identify with your Father, you lost consciousness of your universality, your universal, all-embracing wholeness. But you couldn't lose that which specifically identifies you. And so this conscious awareness that had lost the infinite view identified itself with the only thing remaining, which was the specific identification. You are all universal and specific simultaneously, but you've lost the universal context, the universal experience of your being. So, repeating, the body is the ego's home by its own election. Another way of saying that is that the body is the home of the Christ who has forgotten his Christhood. I want to keep reminding you that when the reference to ego is not reference to some illusion, behaving as though it's real. This is very confusing. You've got to remember that you've never stopped being the Christ that you are. You've never stopped being exactly and in all ways what God is being right there where each of you is. And so all there is to an ego is a son or daughter of God behaving as though he or she is not the son of, or daughter of God, but is instead an independent agent who has forgotten thereby his or her divinity. So all references to the ego are references to the full-fledged Christ behaving as though he isn't, and as I've said, believing his behavior. So you could say the body is your home by your own election, because you have elected to ignore the Father. You have elected to ignore your source in favor of having this unusual, imaginative experience of independence. Continuing, the body is the only identification with which the ego feels safe, because the body's vulnerability is its own best argument that you cannot be of God. Well, you've got to remember that the moment you lost the infinite view, the moment you chose to look at everything independently and began behaving in an unnatural and insane way, all of your perceptions of the kingdom of heaven became colored by the experience of aloneness, and therefore fear, and therefore vulnerability, and therefore an experience of that which is eternal as though it were capable of posing actual threat to your existence, especially by deterioration. Continuing, this is the belief that the ego sponsors eagerly. Mind you, as long as you're believing that you're not the Christ, you must devote yourself to maintaining the imaginative sense of yourself that you have created, and maintain it at all cost. And so the ego eagerly sponsors ways of seeing that cause you to rely upon it and never reach beyond it to that which ultimately would undo it, uncover it as the illusion that it is. Continuing, yet the ego hates the body because it does not accept the idea that the body is good enough to be its home. If the ego were able to conceive that the body is good enough to be its home because it's divine, well, that would undo the ego, because the ego has never claimed divinity, and that the body is a worthy residence for it would require it to embrace the presence of God, because that is the only thing that could make the body good enough to be its home. So, continuing, here is where the mind becomes actually dazed. The mind becomes dazed. The Christ mind becomes dazed. Being told by the ego that the mind, is really part of the body, and that the body is its protector, the mind is also constantly informed that the body cannot protect it. Why? Because the ego knows the body can't protect it. Why? Because you can't protect something that doesn't exist. And so the ego, as I've said, must constantly engage in a constant advertising blitz, which puts forward, out in the open, the suggestion that it's real, and calls for the agreement of everyone else, and manipulates everyone else into agreement. It says it so much that it becomes accepted as a fact, when it's not a fact at all. Repeating. Here is where the mind becomes actually dazed. Being told by the ego that the mind is really part of the body, and the body is its protector. The mind is also constantly informed, by whom? The ego, that the body cannot protect it. This, of course, is not only accurate, but perfectly obvious. Now, it isn't that the body can't protect the ego because the body isn't real, the body is an illusion. It is that the body cannot protect the ego because the ego is an illusion. And an illusion can't be protected. Continuing. Therefore, the mind asks, where can I go for protection? In other words, the unconscious Christ that you are at the moment, that you are experiencing yourself as, asks, where can I go for protection? To which the ego replies, turn to me. The mind, and not without cause, reminds the ego that it has itself insisted that the ego, is identified with the body, so there is no point in turning to it for protection. The ego has no real answer to this, because there is none. But it does have a typical solution, one I know you're all familiar with. It obliterates the question from the mind's awareness. So when the Christ of you has this niggling awareness that there is no safety in all of the places it has been looking for safety, and it asks, where can I go for protection? That's when a wavering of allegiance to the mutually agreed upon definitions occurs. And there is an opportunity to reach beyond each one's own best judgments, which necessarily places your attention in a larger sphere than the separated sense of yourself. So the ego obliterates the question from the mind's awareness. And I will tell you that it does this by distracting you from the question. Continuing, once unconscious, the question can and does produce uneasiness. And I referred to that uneasiness as your divine sanity, saying to you, You're out of your mind. You're trying to function in a way you cannot function. It's time to come back into your right mind. Once unconscious, the question can and does produce uneasiness, but it cannot be answered because it cannot be asked. This is the question which must be asked. Where am I to go for protection? In other words, that needs to be a very real and serious question each of you needs to ask. It is your birthright not to be experiencing fear, vulnerability, debilitation, sin, sickness, death. And so you need to ask the question, where am I to go in order not to experience these things? Continuing, even the insane ask it unconsciously, but it requires real sanity to ask it consciously. Oh, you hear, in fact, each one of you at time has been a whimperer. Oh, what am I to do? What can I do? But it's a rhetorical question rather than a serious question. You're not asking it because you know there's an answer and you expect the answer to be revealed to you if you keep your attention on the desire to know the answer. Your question is a complaint. It's a whine that's supposed to be a means to an end in itself. It's a statement of your dilemma. Which means it's not a request for the answer that will resolve the dilemma. Continuing. When the Bible says, "Seek and ye shall find," it does not mean that you should seek blindly and desperately for something you would not recognize. Meaningful seeking is consciously undertaken, consciously organized, and consciously directed. The goal must be formulated clearly, and this is key, and kept in mind. As a teacher with some experience, let me remind you that learning and wanting to learn are inseparable. All learners learn best when they believe that what they are trying to learn is of value to them. However, values in this world, meaning within the scope of the ego's mutually agreed upon definitions, are hierarchical, and not everything you may want to learn has lasting value. Indeed, many of the things you want to learn, or shall I say think you want to learn, are chosen because their value will not last. Commerce even capitalizes on that. It gets you to want something that's going to be updated in 6 months or improved in a year. That's the way the economy keeps going. By always getting that which won't last or that which won't forever be good enough. Continuing, the ego thinks it is an advantage not to commit itself to anything that is eternal, because the eternal must come from God. Eternalness is the one function which the ego has tried to develop but has systematically failed.